The town slept under a gray winter sky, its rooftops covered in a crust of snow that shimmered faintly under the pale glow of the moon. Lanterns had long been extinguished, smoke no longer rose from chimneys, and the silence of the cold seemed to stretch across every empty street. But on the outskirts of that town, where the neatly painted homes gave way to crumbling shacks and abandoned barns, a boy walked alone. He was no older than 12, though life had carved years of hardship into his face. His name was seldom spoken. To most townsfolk, he was simply the homeless boy. Parents shooed their children away from him, merchants waved him off from their doorsteps, and travelers barely noticed him at all. To them, he was invisible, just another shadow in the alleys. Yet, in his own quiet way, he endured. Each day, he scavenged for scraps, waiting behind the saloon for bones the cook might toss out, or crouching by the blacksmith's shop where embers gave him warmth for a few minutes before he was told to move along. The boy owned almost nothing. His shoes had holes big enough that his toes peeked out when he walked. His trousers were too short, frayed at the edges, and patched so many times with mismatched fabric that they looked more like a quilt than clothing. The only possession he had worth clinging to was an old wool blanket. Faded from years of use, patched with clumsy stitches, it carried the faint scent of smoke from countless campfires. It was more than a blanket. It was his shield against the unforgiving cold of winter nights. Without it, he knew he might not survive. That night, the cold was sharper than usual. The wind slipped through every crack in the ruined barn where he sometimes slept, cutting straight into his skin. He wrapped the blanket tightly around his shoulders, pulling it over his head to trap the little warmth he had left. His breath rose in thin clouds as he huddled in the straw, trying to convince himself that morning would come soon. But hunger gnawed at his stomach, and the ache of loneliness pressed on his chest even harder than the frost. He thought of his past sometimes, though the memories were hazy. There had once been a mother's smile, soft hands tucking him in, and a father's laughter echoing through a small cabin. But those days were long gone. His parents had been taken by sickness when he was very young, leaving him to fend for himself in a world that had no room for orphans. The neighbors had helped at first, offering bread or a place by the fire, but kindness had grown scarce as months turned into years. Eventually, the boy learned not to expect anything from anyone. Yet, despite all of this, he carried something inside him that poverty couldn't strip away. It was a quiet resilience, a small ember of goodness that refused to die. Though the world ignored him, he never let bitterness consume him. When he found a penny on the ground, he spent it on bread and split it with another beggar. When he came across a stray dog shivering in the snow, he shared part of his blanket with it for the night. He was poor, yes, but he still had something to give, even if it was only kindness. As the night deepened, he rose from his bed of straw and stepped out into the frozen fields. The barn was too cold, and sometimes walking kept his blood moving enough to fight the chill. His bare feet crunched over the thin layer of snow, his breath ragged as he pulled the blanket tighter. The moon cast silver light over the world, and the boy lifted his eyes to it, wondering if tomorrow would be any different from today. He had no family, no future, no place that belonged to him. The town behind him had long since turned its back. Still, he whispered into the night, "Maybe one day someone will see me." He didn't know it then, but the night was about to test him in ways greater than hunger or cold. For destiny has a way of finding even the most forgotten souls, and sometimes a single act of compassion can change everything. In the stillness of that winter night, with nothing but his tattered blanket to his name, the boy's story was only just beginning. Soon, the lonely child no one noticed would step into a moment that would make an entire tribe of warriors bow their heads in silence. The night grew darker as the boy wandered farther from the town. His blanket clung tightly to his shoulders, its edges fluttering in the biting wind. Frost painted the ground silver, and each step left shallow prints that soon filled with drifting snow. He had no destination, only the instinct to keep moving, to keep his body from stiffening in the cold. The fields stretched endlessly around him, dotted with skeletal trees that clawed at the sky. Their bare branches creaked as the wind threaded through them, groaning like old bones. Beyond the fields lay the forest, thick and shadowed, its edges blurred by the pale glow of moonlight. The boy usually avoided the forest. The townsfolk told stories of dangers within, wolves, bears, and whispers of tribes who guarded their land fiercely. But tonight, the hunger and cold drove him closer to the dark tree line. He thought maybe he could find shelter beneath the trees, away from the wind that cut across the open land. His thin frame shivered violently as he trudged on. The air stung his lungs, and his teeth chattered so loudly that he pressed his lips together to quiet them. He could almost hear his mother's voice, distant and faint, telling him to keep moving, to be strong. That memory, fragile as smoke, gave him just enough strength to push forward. Then, cutting through the stillness of the night, he heard it, a sound, soft, weak, and almost too faint to notice. At first, he thought it was the wind, whistling strangely, through the trees. But then it came again, a cry, a tiny, desperate cry. He froze, straining his ears. His heart quickened. The sound wasn't animal, it was human. More than that, it was the cry of a baby. The boy's first instinct was disbelief. What child could possibly be out here, alone, in the freezing dark? Yet the sound came again, sharper. This time carrying with it the unmistakable wail of an infant. His breath caught in his throat. Guided by the fragile cries, he stumbled toward the forest's edge. Snow crunched under his feet, his legs numb with cold, but he pressed on. The cries grew clearer with every step, drawing him deeper into the shadows beneath the trees. And then he saw it. There, half hidden in a small hollow beneath a tree, was a bundle, a small swaddled shape wrapped in thin cloth, trembling against the cold. The cloth was damp with frost, the baby's face red from crying, its tiny fists waving helplessly in the air. Its cries pierced the silence, filled with fear and need. The boy's breath caught in his chest. He had never held a baby before. He had never been responsible for anyone but himself, and even then, he barely managed to survive. He knelt down slowly, his hands trembling, not from cold, but from something deeper. "Shh," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Don't cry. I'm here now." The baby's tiny eyes blinked up at him, glistening with tears. Its body shook, violently from the cold, and the boy's heart clenched. He knew what would happen if the child stayed out here much longer. It would freeze before morning. His gaze shifted to his blanket, the one thing that had kept him alive through countless nights like this. Without it, he would be at the mercy of the cold. His body was already weak, his lips already turning blue from the night air. He clutched the blanket tighter around himself, fear prickling in his chest. But then he looked back at the baby, so small, so fragile, so utterly defenseless. What was his suffering compared to this little life? He had endured years of hunger and loneliness. He knew how to fight the cold, how to press on through pain. But this baby, it had no chance at all without help. His decision came not with thought, but with instinct. He pulled the blanket from his shoulders, the sudden rush of cold biting into his skin like knives. His hands shook as he carefully wrapped it around the infant, tucking it close, shielding its tiny body from the frost. The baby's cries softened, its fists relaxing slightly as the warmth of the blanket enclosed it. The boy cradled the child, in his arms, pressing it close to his chest. Though the night air now gnawed mercilessly at his bare skin, There was a strange warmth blooming inside him, a warmth that no fire could have given. "There you go," he whispered softly, rocking the child. "You're safe now. I'll keep you safe." The forest seemed to fall silent around him as if listening. The wind slowed, the branches ceased their groaning, and the world held its breath. The boy didn't notice, too focused on the fragile life he now carried. For the first time in years, he felt needed. For the first time, someone depended on him. But what he did not know was that the night held more than just a baby in need. Unseen eyes watched him from the darkness, silent as the snow, waiting to see what he would do next. The boy sat at the base of the great tree, the baby nestled in his arms, the weight of the night pressing down on him like a heavy cloak. The forest was still, save for the occasional rustle of snow sliding from the branches above. His breath came in shallow clouds, his chest tight with the cold. Every shiver racked his thin frame more violently than the last. The blanket, his blanket, was now wrapped snugly around the infant, cocooning the small body against the bitter frost. For years, that tattered scrap of wool had been his only refuge, the one thing that stood between life and death on nights like this. Now it was gone. Now the chill bit into him without mercy. At first, he thought he could manage. He pressed the baby close to his chest, trying to share what little warmth his body still carried. But the longer he sat, the more he realized the danger. His fingers were stiffening, his lips numb. He could hardly feel his toes anymore. Each breath stung his lungs like shards of ice. Fear crept into his thoughts. Without the blanket, could he survive the night? His body was already weak from hunger, his energy long since drained. He knew what freezing felt like. He had come, close before, in winters past, when he'd been too slow to find shelter. The slow numbness, the drowsy pull of sleep that threatened to lure him into eternal rest. He recognized the signs, and they terrified him. His eyes shifted to the baby, swaddled and quiet now, its tiny chest rising and falling against his own. He thought of placing the infant back in the hollow and pulling the blanket around himself. Again, if he did that, maybe he'd make it until dawn. Maybe he'd live another day. The thought sickened him. Could he really do it? Could he condemn a helpless child to death just to buy himself a few more hours of life? The answer came quickly, burning in his chest even as the cold gnawed at him. No, he couldn't. The boy's life had never held much value to anyone. Not to the townsfolk who ignored him, not to the world that had stripped him of family and home. But here, in this moment, his life meant something. He was the only barrier between this baby and the icy grip of death. His suffering might be the only reason this child survived. He tightened his hold around the infant, tucking it closer beneath his chin. His teeth chattered so hard he could hardly speak, but he whispered through them anyway. You're gonna be all right. I won't let the cold get you. I promise." The baby stirred faintly, a tiny hand escaping the blanket and brushing against his chest. The touch was so small, so fragile, yet it ignited a strange fire inside him. He felt needed. For the first time in his life, he wasn't invisible. Someone depended on him completely, and that responsibility gave him strength he hadn't known he possessed. The night dragged on, every minute stretching into an eternity. The boy rocked the baby gently, humming tunelessly to soothe it. The melody had no words, no real shape, just a faint murmur to break the silence. His body ached, his skin burned where the wind bit at it, but he refused to loosen his grip. The more the cold tried to strip away his strength, the more fiercely he held on. He thought again of his parents, of the warmth he once knew, the safety of being held. Maybe, in some strange way, he was passing that memory forward, giving the baby the comfort he once received. That thought gave him peace, even as exhaustion clawed at his mind. The boy's eyelids grew heavy. He knew he couldn't sleep. To close his eyes now might mean never opening them again. Still, fatigue tugged at him, stronger with each passing hour. He shook his head, forcing himself to stay alert. Every time he drifted, he pressed the baby tighter to remind himself why he had to keep fighting. "This is my choice," he whispered into the cold. "If one of us has to suffer, it should be me." The forest around him seemed to listen, as if the trees themselves respected the vow. Somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped, a sound too sharp, too deliberate to be the wind. The boy flinched, peering into the darkness, but saw nothing. Only shadows shifting between the trees. He had no idea that he was not alone. That hidden eyes were watching from the tree line, silent and unmoving. That every act of sacrifice he made, every shiver, every whispered promise to the baby, was being witnessed. But the boy didn't know this. All he knew was the baby in his arms, the cold biting into his flesh, and the simple truth of his choice. His life was worth less than the one he held, and so he endured. The hours crept by with cruel slowness, each one colder than the last. The boy sat hunched at the base of the great tree, his back pressed against its rough bark, the baby bundled tightly in his arms. The forest was silent, but alive. The creak of trees in the wind, the soft crunch of snow sliding off branches, the occasional flutter of an owl's wings as it passed overhead. Yet to the boy, the night felt endless, a test of will he wasn't sure he could endure. Sleep tugged at him like a sly enemy. His eyelids drooped, heavy as stones, but he forced them open again and again, knowing that if he gave in, he might never wake. He had heard stories of travelers who froze to death in their sleep, their bodies found curled in snowbanks with peaceful expressions, as if the cold had whispered them into eternal rest. He would not let that fate claim him, not while he held the baby. To fight the drowsiness, he began to hum. The tune was faint, shaky from his chattering teeth, but it filled the silence. It wasn't a song he knew, just a string of sounds, half remembered from the lullabies his mother once sang when he was small. He swayed gently, rocking the baby in his arms, as if the act of comforting another gave him a reason to stay awake. The infant stirred now and then, letting out small cries that pierced the night. Each time the boy tightened his hold, whispering, "Shh, I've got you. Don't be scared, I'm here." His voice was weak but steady, and after a while the baby would settle again, its breath soft and rhythmic against his chest. The boy's body, however, grew weaker with each passing moment. The cold had seeped into him fully now, numbing his legs, stiffening his fingers until he could barely move them. He flexed his hands, trying to keep the blood flowing, but the ache was relentless. Every joint felt locked in place, as if the cold was turning him into stone. Still, he endured. He found his thoughts drifting, wandering to places he hadn't dared to think about in years. He imagined what it would be like to belong somewhere, to wake in a bed of his own, with a fire crackling in the hearth and a meal waiting on the table, to have people who looked at him not as a nuisance or a beggar, but as someone worth keeping. He thought of the word family and let it linger in his mind, warming him more than the tattered clothes that clung to his body. For the first time, he wondered if maybe this baby could have that chance. Maybe this child, small and helpless now, would grow up surrounded by love, never knowing the hunger or loneliness he had endured. That thought filled him with a strange kind of hope. If his suffering here meant the child's future was secure, then it was worth every shiver, every ache, every breath that froze in his chest. Time blurred. The boy couldn't tell if minutes or hours passed. The moon drifted across the sky, casting long silver shadows through the trees. Each time he thought he might collapse from exhaustion, the baby would stir again, reminding him of his purpose. He clung to that purpose fiercely, like a sailor gripping the last plank of a wrecked ship in stormy seas. Once he thought he saw movement in the trees, a flicker of shadow, tall and silent, slipping between the trunks. His breath caught, but, when he looked closer, the darkness was empty. Perhaps it was just his weary mind playing tricks on him. He shook his head, focusing once more on the child. "Almost morning," he whispered, though he wasn't sure how long it truly was until dawn. The words were as much for himself as for the baby, a promise, a reminder to hold on. His body trembled uncontrollably now. His lips were blue, his skin pale, but his arms remained locked around the infant. No force, neither the cold nor hunger nor fear, could pry the baby from his hold. It was as if all the strength left in his small, frail frame had been poured into this single act of protection. The boy's vigil continued hour after hour, sleepless and painful. Yet even in his suffering, there was a quiet dignity in the way he sat beneath that tree, refusing to surrender. Alone, forgotten by the world, he had found a reason to fight harder than he ever had before. And though he didn't know it, the forest was not as empty as it seemed. Eyes watched from the shadows, silent and patient, bearing witness to his sacrifice. The boy thought he was keeping his vigil alone, but in truth, an entire tribe was watching him prove himself stronger than many grown men. The boy's body trembled violently now, his arms aching as he held the baby close, but still he refused to loosen his grip. His head drooped, then jerked upright again as he fought against the heaviness pulling at his eyes. He whispered to himself, to the child, to the night. Anything to stay awake. Yet what he could not see, hidden just beyond the veil of shadows, was that he was no longer truly alone. From the moment he had lifted the baby from the hollow beneath the tree, he had been watched. Figures stood among the darkened trees, silent as stone. Their breaths were steady, their movements minimal, blending so completely with the forest that no untrained eye could detect them. They were warriors, men of the nearby native tribe, out searching for the child that had gone missing from their camp earlier that evening. At first, when they saw the orphan boy approach the infant, they prepared to act. One warrior even raised his hand to signal the others, ready to reclaim the child. But something stopped them. The boy's actions were not what they expected. He had not taken the baby for ransom, nor run toward the town to claim a reward. Instead, he stripped himself of his only protection against the bitter cold, wrapping the child in his blanket without hesitation. The warriors exchanged silent glances in the moonlight. Their leader, a tall man with a face carved by years of hardship and wisdom, raised his hand for silence. They would wait. They would see what this ragged boy chose to do, and so they watched. They saw how he held the baby close, rocking it gently through the night. They saw the way his lips moved, whispering words of comfort, though his own body shook violently. They saw his resolve, his refusal to reclaim the blanket even as frost glazed his skin. Hours passed, and still they remained in the shadows, their numbers many. Some crouched on the branches above, others pressed against the trunks below, all bearing silent witness to the boy's sacrifice. The forest itself seemed to conspire in their secrecy. Every crunch of snow was muffled, every shift of weight disguised by the groan of trees in the wind. The boy, exhausted and unaware, never suspected a thing. To him, the world was narrowed down to two fragile lives, his and the baby's, and the desperate struggle to keep one of them alive. Yet to the warriors it was more than that. It was a test of spirit, one the boy had never intended to take, but passed nonetheless. In their people's eyes, strength was not measured only by muscle or weapons. It was measured by sacrifice, by the willingness to give of oneself for another. And here, in the bitter silence of winter, They saw a child with nothing, no family, no shelter, no place in the world, choose to give everything he had for a life that was not his own. The elder warrior's eyes softened as he watched. He thought of the boy's thin frame, his ragged clothes, the way his teeth chattered as he whispered lullabies to the baby. This was no ordinary child of the town. This was someone with the heart of a warrior, though the world had treated him as less than nothing. Still, they did not reveal themselves, not yet. It was their way to observe in silence, to let the night unfold without interference. Perhaps the boy's kindness was only fleeting. Perhaps, when exhaustion overcame him, he would falter. The warriors waited, patient as the trees, to see what truth lay in his heart. The boy stirred again, glancing into the darkness as though sensing unseen eyes. His own gaze was weary, unfocused, but for a heartbeat, it seemed he knew he was being watched. Then he looked back down at the baby, adjusting the blanket tenderly around its tiny face, and the moment passed. The elder warrior nodded once, his decision forming like stone in his mind. At dawn, they would reveal themselves, but not with weapons. Drawn. No, when the sun rose, the boy would learn he had not spent this night unseen. His sacrifice would be honored, his spirit acknowledged. For now, though, the warriors kept their vigil alongside his, hidden in the silence of the forest. And so, as the boy fought against sleep, believing himself utterly alone, 100 unseen guardians bore witness to his courage, their respect deepening with every shiver of his body and every soft whisper he offered to the child in his arms. The long night was nearing its end. The boy did not know how many hours had passed since he first found the baby, only that his body felt heavier than stone. Every shiver rattled his bones. His lips were cracked, his breath shallow, his fingers nearly too stiff to hold the child. Yet still, he clutched the bundle against his chest, refusing to let go. The forest seemed to sense the coming of dawn. The wind that had howled bitterly through the branches now grew gentler, quieter, as if even the night was weary. The owls had retreated, their calls replaced by the faint stirrings of other creatures waking in the underbrush. The stars overhead began to dim one by one as the horizon slowly lightened with the faintest shade of gray. The boy lifted his head. His eyes were swollen from fatigue, but he noticed the change. A faint glow, fragile yet unmistakable, spread over the treetops. Morning. He felt both relief and dread. Relief that he had survived this long, dread that his body might not hold out much longer. He was so weak he could barely feel his own arms. Still, when the baby stirred, whimpering softly, he mustered what little strength he had to rock it gently, whispering, "Shh, it's all right. See, the sun's coming. We made it." The child quieted again, its tiny breaths steady against his chest. The boy exhaled shakily, though the motion sent another wave of dizziness through him. His body begged him to collapse, to sink into the snow and let the sleep he had resisted finally take him. But something deep within, stronger than hunger, stronger than cold, kept him upright. The first rays of dawn pierced through the trees, spilling gold across the snow. The boy squinted, blinking against the sudden light. The forest transformed before his eyes. Branches glistened with frost. The ground sparkled as though dusted with diamonds, and the sky above shifted from gray to pale pink. It was a moment of beauty, one he might have marveled at, if not for the weight of exhaustion pressing down on him, and then from the corner of his vision, he saw movement. At first he thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow shifting, a tree swaying. But no, it was more than that. Shapes began to emerge from the forest, silent and deliberate. Figures stepped from the tree line, tall and imposing, their silhouettes dark against the rising sun. The boy's heart lurched. His breath caught in his throat. One figure became 2, then 10, then dozens more. They moved with precision, their footsteps soundless in the snow until the clearing around him was no longer empty. He blinked, his weary eyes. Widening as the truth struck him, they were warriors. Their presence was overwhelming. 100 men cloaked in furs, their faces painted with solemn markings, their weapons at their sides. They stood in perfect formation, not charging, not speaking, just standing, watching, surrounding him in a vast semicircle of silence. The boy's pulse thundered in his ears. Fear clawed at his chest. He had heard stories of tribes, how fierce their warriors were, how they defended their people with unbreakable resolve. And here he was, a ragged homeless boy, holding one of their own in his arms. What would they think? Would they believe he had stolen the child? Would they see him as a threat? His instincts screamed at him to run, but his body was far too weak. Even if he could, he would not abandon the baby. No. If they meant to harm him, he would face them. And if they meant to take the child, he would make sure they did so, knowing he had protected it until the very end. The boy swallowed hard, shifting the infant closer to his chest, his small frame trembling not just from cold now, but from the weight of the moment. His gaze darted among the warriors, searching for their intentions, but their faces gave nothing away. They stood utterly still, their eyes fixed upon him, the dawn's light reflecting in their unblinking stares. The silence was suffocating. No one moved, no one spoke. Only the wind whispered through the trees, carrying with it the boy's ragged breaths. The boy lowered his head, bracing himself. He thought of the night he had endured, of the choice he had made. If this was the end, if the warriors struck him down, he would not regret what he had done. The baby was alive, warm in his arms, and that was all that mattered. The sun climbed, higher, gilding the warriors in light, and still they did not advance. 100 men stood in silence, watching the frail boy and the infant he cradled, and in that moment, though he did not yet understand it, the boy's sacrifice had spoken, louder than words ever could. The boy's breath came in short, shallow bursts as the ring of warriors stood silently around him. Their presence pressed down on him like the weight of a mountain. He felt as though the very air had thickened, each inhale more difficult than the last. 100 pairs of eyes were fixed on him, unblinking, unreadable. The boy's heart pounded in his chest, and though his body already trembled from cold, now it shook with something sharper. Fear. He had never been surrounded before. He had been chased from barns, scolded from kitchens, mocked in the streets, but never had so many eyes watched him at once. And these were not townsfolk. These were warriors. Their faces were painted with dark lines of ash and ochre, their braids adorned with beads and feathers that whispered faintly in the dawn breeze. They carried bows, spears, and axes, though none were raised. Even at rest, the sheer power they held made his stomach twist. The boy tightened his arms around the baby, instinctively shielding it with his body. His back pressed harder against the tree trunk, as though he could melt into it, vanish, and escape the circle of stairs. His lips parted, but no words came. What could he say to them? How could he explain why he, a ragged, homeless boy, was cradling one of their own? He lowered his gaze, unable to meet their eyes. His mind raced. Would they think he had kidnapped the infant? Would they believe he had meant harm? He had heard whispers in town of tribes avenging even the smallest insult to their kin. If they thought he had wronged the child, they might strike him down where he sat. Yet despite the fear rising like fire in his chest, the boy did not release the baby. His arms stayed firm, his body curled protectively over the bundle. His voice was barely more than a whisper, cracked and trembling, but he forced the words out anyway. I didn't mean no harm. I just wanted to keep the baby warm. The silence that followed was unbearable. No reply came, no movement, no sound beyond the creak of branches in the morning wind. It was as if the forest itself had frozen, waiting. His heart thundered, louder. His throat burned. He thought he saw one of the warriors shift, the glint of a spear catching the sunrise, and his breath hitched. Any second now, he thought. Any second, they would take the baby from him, and perhaps take his life as well. But still, his arms would not loosen. If they wanted the child, they would have to take it from his frozen, shaking grasp. The boy lifted his eyes, just for a heartbeat, to the figure he sensed was their leader. The man stood taller than the rest, his posture commanding without effort, his gaze steady as stone. There was no anger in his expression, but neither was there softness. It was a face carved by years of battle and burden. Their eyes met briefly, and the boy quickly looked down again, his courage faltering beneath that steady stare. The baby stirred then, whimpering softly. The boy bent his head over the bundle, rocking it gently, murmuring the only comfort he knew. "Shh. It's all right. I've got you. I won't let go." His voice was barely audible, but the words carried through the silence. And though he spoke to the infant, every warrior in that circle heard him. Another shift passed through the crowd, subtle, nearly imperceptible. A few heads tilted, a few eyes narrowed, but none spoke. The air between them was thick with meaning the boy could not grasp. The moment stretched, his fear twisting tighter with every heartbeat. He braced himself, preparing for the worst, yet clung all the more fiercely to the baby. "If they strike me down," he thought, "they'll know I tried. They'll know I never let go." The rising sun climbed higher, bathing the clearing in gold. The warriors stood like statues, the boy curled beneath the tree and the baby safe in his arms. It was a standoff without weapons drawn, a battle of silence, of will, of spirit. And though the boy trembled with fear, though his body threatened to collapse beneath the weight of exhaustion and cold, his choice had already been made. He would face whatever came, pain, punishment, or death, so long as the child in his arms was safe. The boy's arms ached from clutching the child so tightly, yet he did not ease his grip. His thin body was a shield, his threadbare shirt barely enough to block the morning wind, but still he held on. His fear was sharp and heavy, like an arrow aimed at his chest, but something deeper kept him rooted in place, an unwillingness to let the baby go until he knew it was safe. The silence around him grew heavier. 100 warriors stood unmoving, their shadows stretching long across the frost-bitten ground. Their breath fogged faintly in the crisp dawn, rising in unison like smoke signals. To the boy, it felt as though time itself had stopped. He dared a glance upward. Their eyes were on him, every single one, watching not with fury, but with something he couldn't name. They weren't rushing forward. They weren't dragging the child from his arms. They weren't speaking, either. Only standing, only looking, as if his every breath mattered. The boy swallowed hard, his throat dry. He remembered stories the townsfolk whispered at night, of warriors fierce and unyielding, striking vengeance swiftly when one of their own was harmed. Yet here they stood, in silence, no accusations, no blades raised, only quiet. His body trembled. He was so small before them, so ragged, so powerless. But then, something shifted. The elder, the tall man whose presence commanded all others, stepped forward. Not fast, not threatening, but with a measured pace, his moccasins soundless on the frozen earth. The boy stiffened, clutching the baby even closer, his breath catching. The elder stopped just a few feet away. The air between them was thick, alive, as though the forest itself was listening. The elder's gaze moved not to the boy at first, but to the child in his arms. His dark eyes softened slightly as he took in the sight. The baby swaddled not in fur or cloth, but in a torn, patched blanket, the boy's own body curled protectively around it. For a long heartbeat, nothing moved. Then, something unexpected happened. The elder's head lowered. A bow, not deep, not drawn out, but a slow, deliberate nod of acknowledgement. Behind him, as if carried by one breath, the circle of warriors mirrored the gesture. One by one, 100 heads lowered in perfect unison, their silence transforming into something sacred. The boy's heart skipped. He blinked in disbelief, not trusting what he was seeing. They weren't condemning him. They weren't threatening him. They were honoring him? The baby stirred in his arms, letting out a small sigh, and the boy relaxed slightly, though his fear hadn't vanished entirely. He whispered again to the child, more for himself than anyone else. "It's all right. It's all right now." But the words carried differently this time. He felt them, not just said them. For the first time in longer than he could remember, he believed them. The silence stretched, but it no longer pressed down like a weight. It lifted, filled instead with a quiet reverence. The boy didn't understand the customs of the people before him, but he understood respect when he saw it. No one moved to take the baby by force. No one raised a weapon. Instead, they stood as though his act had spoken louder than words ever could. The boy looked up again, this time longer, meeting the elder's gaze. And to his surprise, the man's eyes did not hold coldness, but something like recognition, as though he was not looking at a ragged orphan, but at someone who had revealed the heart of a warrior. The boy's breath quivered. His fear didn't vanish completely. How could it? But something else grew stronger beneath it. A strange, fragile sense of worth. He had always been invisible in the town, always brushed aside, overlooked, treated as less than nothing. Yet, here, surrounded by 100 silent warriors, he was being seen, truly seen. Not as a thief, not as a beggar, not as a burden, but as a boy who had given away his last possession, his only comfort, for the sake of another. The silence was no longer terrifying. It was honor. And for the first time in his life, the boy did not feel small. The boy's arms ached as though carved from stone, but he did not loosen his hold on the baby. His lips were pale from the cold, his fingers stiff, yet he endured. Before him, the elder remained still, his head raised now from the bow of respect. Slowly, the boy could hear every crunch of frost beneath the man's moccasins. The elder stepped closer. The warriors parted behind him, silent as shadows, their presence both overwhelming and strangely comforting. The boy's breath caught when the elder came within reach. Every instinct screamed at him to clutch the child tighter, to run, though. His legs had no strength left. He had always lived by keeping his distance, by trusting no one. But here, now, something inside him whispered differently. The elder's eyes rested on the child first. His weathered hand reached forward, not with force, but with reverence. He paused, as though asking silently for permission. The boy hesitated, his grip trembling. His heart thudded like a drum inside his chest. And then he let go. The elder lifted the baby gently, wrapping it in his strong arms with a tenderness the boy hadn't expected from someone so imposing. The infant stirred but did not cry. Instead, it nestled into the elder's chest, as though it knew instinctively it was home. The boy sat back, suddenly aware of the emptiness in his arms. For a heartbeat, he felt stripped, exposed. He had nothing left now, not the blanket, not the baby, not even his strength. Just himself. The elder turned his gaze back to him. What the boy saw there was not judgment, nor suspicion. It was gratitude. In a low, steady voice, the elder spoke words the boy didn't understand. The language was foreign, rolling like a song of the earth. Yet the tone carried meaning beyond words, respect, acknowledgement, acceptance. When the elder finished, he gestured with his free hand. A warrior stepped forward, carrying something across his arms. It was a cloak, thick, fur-lined, warm as the sun itself. The boy stared, not daring to believe it was meant for him. The elder draped it across his narrow shoulders. The weight of it startled him, not heavy like a burden, but steady like an embrace. The warmth seeped through his shivering body at once, and tears pricked his eyes before he could stop them. He had never owned something so fine. Never been wrapped in anything beyond rags and scraps. This was not a mere gift of fabric. It was a symbol, something more than he could yet comprehend. Around him, the warriors shifted, not in hostility, but in formation. They closed the circle, again surrounding him, but this time it felt different. He was no longer trapped. He was included. Their silence was not cold. It was reverence. Their gazes were not hard. They were watchful, as though guarding something precious. The boy, who had always walked alone, now found himself in the center of something vast and unspoken. The elder spoke again, his voice carrying authority and gentleness in equal measure. Though the boy could not grasp the words, he understood their intent. "You are one of us." The realization sank into him slowly, like warmth spreading through his frozen limbs. They were not casting him aside. They were not punishing him for touching what was not his. They were welcoming him. The boy lowered his head, overwhelmed. He had given away his last possession, expecting nothing in return, and in doing so, he had gained something greater than he had ever dreamed of: belonging. The warriors remained silent, their discipline unbroken, but their stillness spoke louder than any cheer or shout could. They accepted him, not as a beggar to be pitied, not as an outsider to be shunned, but as one whose heart had proven worthy. The boy lifted his eyes, his breath trembling in the morning air. His life had shifted in a single night. He was no longer invisible, no longer forgotten. Wrapped in the warmth of the cloak, surrounded by the strength of 100 warriors, he felt something he had never known before. He felt like a brother. The forest was quiet, not the silence of emptiness, but a deep, living quiet, like the pause of the earth before it breathes again. The boy sat wrapped in the fur cloak, the baby now safely cradled in the elder's arms, while the 100 warriors stood in perfect stillness around them. For the first time in his life, the boy did not feel alone. The morning sun rose higher, casting soft light across the clearing. Frost on the grass sparkled like 1,000 tiny stars, and the smoky breath of men and horses drifted upward in the cold air. He glanced around, still trying to understand. These men, tall, fierce, and silent, had come not to punish him, but to honor him. It was a truth so large that his heart could scarcely hold it. The elder approached once more, the baby cooing softly against his chest. He knelt before the boy, lowering himself so their eyes were level. The boy blinked, startled. No one had ever lowered themselves to meet him before. He had always been the one crouching, begging, looking upward for mercy. The elder spoke again, his words steady and melodic, the weight of many years carried in each sound. The boy did not understand the language, yet he felt its meaning in his bones. You are no longer cast aside. You have a place. The warriors shifted as the elder finished. One by one, they brought offerings forward: a pouch of dried meat, a leather flask of water, a carved knife, its handle polished smooth with age. Each gift was laid before the boy with silent reverence. His eyes widened, overwhelmed. He wanted to refuse. He was no warrior, no great man to deserve such honor. But each time he tried to protest, the warrior's calm expressions told him there was no need. This was not charity. This was kinship. Tears stung his eyes hot against the chill of the morning. He lowered his head, whispering a shaky, "Thank you." He didn't know if they understood the words, but he knew they felt the truth in his voice. The elder stood and gestured toward the forest. Two warriors stepped forward, each extending a hand. Not to drag him, not to push him, but to invite him. For a moment, the boy froze. His mind pulled back to memories of alleys, of hunger, of townsfolk who looked past him as though he did not exist. He had always belonged nowhere. What if this too was temporary? What if they changed their minds? But then he looked at the baby, safe, warm, breathing softly in the elder's arms. The child had survived because of him, and he had survived because of the choice to give. That choice had led to this moment. Slowly, he reached out and took their hands. The warriors helped him rise. His legs trembled, but they held. The fur cloak slid around him like a shield, the weight no longer strange, but familiar. Together, they began to move toward the forest. The line of warriors closed in around him, not as captors, but as guardians. He was surrounded on all sides, protected. Each step carried him farther from the life he had known, the life of hunger and loneliness. Each step carried him closer to something new, something he had always longed for, but never dared to hope for. Family. The town behind him would never know what had happened that night. They would never know of the boy who gave away his only blanket, or of the warriors who stood in silence to honor him. The world would move on, blind to the miracle that had unfolded in the frost of dawn. But the boy knew. The warriors knew. The forest knew. And as they disappeared into the trees, the boy lifted his face to the rising sun. For the first time in his life, he didn't feel the bitter bite of the cold. He felt warmth, inside and out. He was no longer the homeless boy who had nothing. He was a brother, a son, a part of something greater than himself. And as the 100 warriors walked with him into their world, the boy understood. The blanket he had given away had not left him empty. It had opened the door to a new dawn of belonging,